Welcome. Hello. This is Spotlights. It's the podcast series for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And on today's episode, I'm really happy to welcome Evan Barry. So Evan, welcome.
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm proud to be here.
I'm curious to hear a little bit about your relationship to the study of religion and ecology, specifically religion and climate change. But first, I guess I really want to hear about some of the teaching that you've been engaging in, because you're at Arizona State University, where environmental humanities is just booming and buzzing. So what's going on there lately?
Sure. So I feel really lucky. My position here is technically in environmental humanities, even though I'm located in a religious studies faculty. I guess my business card says environmental humanities because they want a person who is able to connect the study of religion with all of the other dynamic stuff that's happening on campus in the Department of English and in history. We have something called a School of Social Transformation, where a lot of work that would normally be in like cultural anthropology or like critical race and gender studies is located. And so all of those folks are connected in interesting ways. And I really like the model we have here. With respect to teaching, there's a couple of undergraduate courses that I've already sort of dived into. One of them is called Sustainability, Nature, and Religion, and that's jointly listed between the School of Sustainability and Religious Studies. And then right now I'm teaching a grad class called Religion and the Anthropocene. I'm really jazzed about that. That's my most favorite thing I'm doing right now.
Nice. That sounds great. Yeah, especially developing kind of new classes that are out there on the cutting edge of where the research is at. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And
it's a blast. The students are really responding.
man, that's great. Especially in Arizona. I mean, you're in a desert, so it's like a desert humanities kind of initiative happening there. I think deserts get short shrift too much.
They do. One of the really early works that I might call environmental humanities is this book. It's by Joseph Wood Crutch, called A Desert Year, and he's an evolutionary biologist who got a fellowship at the University of Arizona back in, I think, the late 1940s. And he rented a house outside of town and he wrote about it. And it's a lovely meditation on philosophy and deserts and biology. I mean, that's a background theme that is ripe for further work.
That's so great. Yeah, I feel like we're starting to enter an era where this kind of interdisciplinary work is finding a niche. And it's not just something to be held against you that you've been crossing these disciplinary boundaries.
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. Small steps, but it's definitely in the right direction. So, along with the stuff you're doing now, I'm always curious how people got into this work, precisely because it's so interdisciplinary. I feel like there's not always a lot of incentives coming from academic institutions for people to cross these kind of boundaries. So what was it in your life or in your studies where you started to think these are the kind of issues I need to be focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually a moment I could point to that I got interested in this topic. As an undergraduate religion major, we had a senior seminar on theodicy, and I wanted to write in my paper for that about the intersection between Darwinian thought and explanations of evil, and this whole question of the parasitic wasps in Darwin, and how upsetting those were to him, and sort of how you account for a world where there's so much violence, and offer it sort of a theological richness. And I got a lot of negative feedback on that paper. Maybe it wasn't well written. It was, I was still learning how to be a writer at the time, but the categories just didn't compute for the professor I had at the time, who was trained. His PhD is from the early 1960s. He was really thinking about the history of religions, just working with different categories. And so, I'd been studying ecology and environment also as an undergraduate, and I didn't see that tension. And the fact that I ran up into leaders who felt that tension gave me an incentive to try to push a little bit on those boundaries.
Nice. Like something's here on this growing edge. Yeah, I remember hearing something similar from a friend who was interested in studying psychology and goes to a psychology professor, and they're like, "Oh no, no, this is religion." I'm like, okay. Go to the religion professor, and they're like, "No, this is psychology." I'm like,
Right,
okay, well, I guess maybe I'm doing something new here a little bit.
right.
Yeah, and it's just amazing how much these studies have kind of blown up over the last 10 or 20 years. But in the 90s, it was relatively unheard of to have like a career oriented around this kind of intersection.
Absolutely. So there are a handful of folks in the religion and environment world uh, who trained not with the folks that were established in the 1990s. So obviously, Bron Taylor and Mary Lavan Tucker and a few other people, Laurel Kearns, were already working on these issues and had a visible body of scholarship at that time. But then there's a few of us who sort of found our way into it from other quarters. And I think one of the real positive things that's happened over the last 10 to 15 years has been that there's now such a pluralism of approaches that there's a bit more of a ferment in how you can think about the issues and what students who are training in these fields get, right? They're not just getting 2 or 3 dimensions, they're getting 10 or 15 dimensions, which I think I didn't really get at that stage of my career.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's so many more perspectives, so many more people working on things, and also avenues for publication have opened up a lot more. So yeah, it's nice to see, because then there's going to be more spaces for the next generation coming up to engage in this stuff as well. And
I
obviously,
do
as the
think
crisis is getting worse for the environment, I think people are going to start paying attention to these sides of it as well.
Yeah, I think that the environmental humanities will be an increasingly large swath of what we think of when we think of why humanities education is important. But I do think that there are still challenges for people working in the environmental humanities from a religion or religious studies perspective. Um, that there are a lot of people interested, say, for instance, in dystopian and apocalyptic literatures who would want to talk about religion, but don't think or frame those issues in the same way as folks who come at it with a more formal training. So it's we're not done with sort of those tensions yet. So I really do think one of the reasons why there's so much activity and interest in this issue is that it's onto something. But then I still think there's some unresolved questions around what the place of religion is in the environmental humanities writ large.
Yeah, that's true, right? Because it's kind of like environmental philosophy, environmental literature, history, and then people are like, oh yeah, religion's covered in all those. Like, well, yeah, it's
Right,
covered in those, but we also have some of our own methodologies and our own history, our own texts, and it might be part of it. But yeah, religion's always kind of the last to be included. People are kind of wary of it because of its presence in the public sphere, right? They have a bit of an allergy
right.
to religion. I know that's a big part of your work also, is engaging religion in the public sphere just in general. Do you see any really, what are the kind of biggest obstacles you see to getting religion kind of more acknowledged, or having people talk about it more, talk about it more on its own terms and not just part of these other disciplines? What are some of the places we should be pushing?
Yeah. So I'll actually later this evening be teaching in the graduate seminar I mentioned earlier, and we're reading Anna Gade's book, Muslim Environmentalisms. And it's a great book, recommended to all. And she identifies this problem that you raise in a really clear way that I appreciate, which is that there are the concept environment, or the idea that there are normative commitments called broadly environmentalism, is often taken for granted, and then those commitments are connected to other things like cultural differences or traditional environmental knowledge or religious traditions. And the mismatch there is often there's a lot of complexity, and a lot of it is political complexity about how those are connected. So she's tracing the ways that development discourses and sort of global finance, it wants there to be something like a connection between Islam and environmentalism, without necessarily wanting to take on board the way that different, quite diverse Muslim communities might not share those broad scale international normative commitments around the environment. So that question to me around how the normativity between religion and environmentalisms as a plural category flows back and forth, that to me is really a major research frontier.
That's great. Yeah, kind of deconstructing what environmentalism meant to begin with. So yeah, at this point, things like 1960s environmentalism, now that's so solidified, everybody just takes that for granted. I know in my teaching, I always have to tell people, like, if it's environmental ethics, I'm like, this doesn't mean environmentalism. That's
Right.
one of the things we're looking at. But I'm sure you've heard stuff, you've seen things on TV, and you've heard things from different people, and kind of the pop culture idea of like tree huggers and stuff like that. I'm like, it's much more complicated, and especially when you get into religion, like kind of like the creation care movement, right? With some Christians being like, it's not really the environment for us, it's
Right.
creation, and
Right.
that's going to frame these issues in a very different way, which might have some positive overlap, but it could have some tensions as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's good. That's a good place to push, and a tough one because at this point it's just so ingrained in people's assumptions that they're like, "No, I think I know what environmentalism is. I'm pretty
Well,
sure."
and in the United States, these questions can be really impoverished because we tend to frame everything as a Manichaean struggle between one side and the other side of the culture wars, and that kind of binary framing is so uh, lacking in nuance that all of the variety of ways that people both on the political right and the political left uh, have ideas and commitments and affects that connect their spirituality with their ethics, with their understandings of what the world is, that's not just environmentalism, it's a whole range of things. And there's points of overlap that often get left out, or there's points of divergence that get silenced because either you believe or don't believe in climate change. There's so much more going on than our media framework is able to talk about, that I think those are important questions to deal with in this field and in the academic space, right, in the university classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and about climate change in particular, obviously that's maybe the issue that looms largest among all kinds of environmental issues, and so heavily politicized. But also, just the science of it hasn't necessarily been communicated in a way where the general public has very good access to it. And so I'm thinking of some of the fires, right, that have been hitting the West Coast and Arizona lately, and you can kind of see this debate in the public of people wanting to say this is climate change, and people are like, no, it's not. It's and they try and reduce it to more local things, which are definitely part of it. The suppression of indigenous land management practices, for instance. So I'm wondering how you engage issues of climate change in particular in the classroom or kind of in public-facing scholarship.
Yeah, I think the way you put it about this debate between different groups who say that it's either universally it's climate change or that it's not climate change and then it's in fact local issues is related to what we were just talking about the culture wars, right? This isn't binary that fails to appreciate a lot of what's going on, right? Of course, climate change is not merely the presence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's also the the depletion of carbon sinks at the global scale and also at the local scale. It's the kinds of economic adaptation strategies that communities come up with to deal with the fact that ocean acidification is weakening their fisheries reserves. So all of that, it's such a dynamic, multifaceted issue that it doesn't really help. I mean, yes, the fires in California in the summer of 2020 are intensified by climate change. Climate change didn't uniquely cause them. And being able to think probabilistically, right, that fires are more frequent, the season is longer, they're more intense because there's more drier fuel, and are more hotter days over a longer period of the year. Like those kinds of they're not linear causalities, right? They're probabilistic causalities, and people really struggle with that stuff. And being able to have like informed public conversations where we can accept that it's not linear, but that it's correlative is really tricky. That I think that's a place we should all be pushing in our public voices.
Right. Which then means having to soften some of those kind of political biases and be willing to see some nuance instead of being so afraid, oh, if I acknowledge this part of it, then people are going to think I'm on this side of the aisle.
Right.
If I say this one word, people are going to say I'm over here. And a little more willingness to be flexible and adaptable would be great. Pushing that in that direction seems very difficult, but that seems to be the thing with the humanities, teaching people how to communicate, how to work through differences through dialogue and mutual understanding. This has got to be the way. So nice to hear, more people going in that direction. I'm wondering, at ASU, what are the plans for building out the religious dimension of environmental humanities? Is that happening more? Or
Yeah,
you're not just the token religion guy?
no, I'm not. So first of all, already in the religious studies faculty, we have Hava Tarosh Samuelson, who has a really distinguished record of work on Judaism and the environment, and also Todd Swanson, who's published a lot on this topic. He works on Quechua people in the Ecuadorian Amazonian region, and a lot about the relationship between plants and communities, and the role of language in shaping that. So there's other really interesting folks just in my local department, but then more broadly across campus, there's other stuff going on. Because ASU is so committed to innovation, sort of things are constantly changing in terms of how collectives are organized on campus, and some big picture changes are going on. One of those is the creation of the Global Futures Laboratory. It's sort of an umbrella collective on campus that brings together the School of Sustainability along with a number of other pieces. And one of the initiatives in that is the Human Factor Initiative, which will focus on the environmental humanities and try to connect work in the environmental humanities, including and especially, I think it's called Sustainability, Ethics, and the Sacred. That is a dimension of the human factor that they'll try to be keeping in conversation with the work they do on, global environmental science and sustainability science and policy.
Nice. That's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. When a commitment to innovation is including innovation in religious studies, that's not always where innovation goes. I think if you ask somebody, what do you think of? You think innovation? Like, I don't know, science and technology.
Well, and we need to, we in the humanities in general, and we in religious studies in particular, really need to fight to get our place at that table. But I have found here at ASU that if you get to the table, people really listen to you and work with you and find ways to collaborate on these topics.
That's great. And the more that happens, then other people can kind of use you as the model. They're like, well, at ASU, they're doing it. We don't want to be left behind. So
That's
let's hope. I see that happening in a few places, not that many. And of course, I'm always concerned that the kind of urgency of our situation demands a lot of kind of rapid transformation. And especially these last few years, I think a lot of people are feeling that. So there's always this extra sense that we need to push fast. And innovation, great, but it needs to be quick innovation too.
Yes.
Yep.
We need innovation around immediate, rapid divestment from fossil fuels and decarbonization of the economy. And those things have strong cultural dimensions that people in the humanities are able to speak to in the ways that the folks working on the solar engineering side of that equation, that's not their specialty.
Right. Talking about like the way oil has worked its way into our culture, petrocultures, and that kind of thing. Yeah. Oh, and the way that apocalyptic imaginaries are driving our love of fossil fuels. And yeah, that's just a little beyond the average solar engineer.
And both of those things are places where the humanities have a strong contribution to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm curious, what kind of publications and things do you have out recently, or maybe something forthcoming? Not, there's all these big issues we're talking about. Publications sometimes seem very small and insignificant, like, oh, it's a line on our CV and things like that. But at the same time, these kinds of things are helping to inform a lot of people, and it's building the field and definitely helping younger scholars realize that there's a niche for them. So always happy to hear about kind of new books and articles. What are you
Sure.
working on?
So I'll tell you a little bit about what's just on the horizon and then about what I'm working on for down the road.
Great.
So the project that I had been working on at American University for a few years called Religion and Climate Change in Cross-Regional Perspective wrapped up, and the very protracted process of getting 2 edited volumes out with the university press is, we're right at the finish line of that. David Haberman is editing one of those volumes on called Understanding Religion, or Understanding Climate Change Through Religious Life Worlds. And it's sort of about the intersections between adaptation and religion and cultural change. And then the other is called Climate Politics and the Power of Religion. And I'm editing that. These are both from Indiana University Press. They'll both be out sometime this winter. And the volume that I'm doing is around the engagement of religious actors with climate politics, but then also the ways in which, especially national scale religious dimensions, shape debates around climate change differently in different parts of the world. So we're very familiar with the role of religion in sort of constraining the American debate around climate change. But that set of constraints looks really different in nations as diverse as the Philippines and Brazil and India. So we have chapters exploring those, Trinidad as well. Just thinking about that as a comparative issue. So that's what I've been working on until I literally will be sending the manuscript, the final copy of the manuscript, off later today.
I know, right?
And then I'm at the early stages of a book project about religion and fossil fuels. I'm thinking about petrocultures in comparison, thinking about this question of religion and the imaginary tools necessary to the work of decarbonization.
Nice. Are you looking at a particular tradition or area?
I'm looking at several cases, and sort of how I conduct the research in a pandemic and post-pandemic world is a little messy. I did a bunch of field work before the pandemic in Norway. I've done some here in the United States and some in Guyana, which they just found massive offshore oil holdings that Exxon is producing already. And those are really changing the political landscape in a religiously tense country. And so I'm thinking about these questions of how existing patterns of religion are complicated and intersect with the arrival of the petroleum economy, and what we can learn from that, and how those lessons might point in different directions for a deconflicted religious future.
Nice. I like that. Deconflicted. Nice. Not all peaceful getting along, but deconflicted. Yeah, I like that framing.
More hope.
What was going on in Norway?
Well, I don't want to spill the beans because I'm still writing about it.
It's true,
But
yeah.
Obviously, Norway is of the European nations and of most of the wealthy nations in the world, the United States excluded, one of the largest democracies that produces fossil fuels. And so it's a funny exception in a lot of ways to the assumptions we make about what petrostates look like. I think the idea that Russia and Iran and Saudi Arabia are the natural political environments for major oil producers, and maybe the United States makes good sense in that category rather than in the same category as Norway or Scotland. But this question of how we think about the relationship between religion, politics, and oil looks really different in different parts of the world.
Nice. Oh, that's going to be great.
I can't wait. I'm jazzed. I just need to get this stupid pandemic thing out of the way so I can actually work on it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, even for research that's not fieldwork oriented, it's harder for everybody just to go to the library and do things like that. So yeah,
Right.
it's a tough one. I think good for some. I have some students that are surprisingly good at finding anything online. You mentioned something, they're like, oh no, I'll get you a free PDF. I know where that's at. So
Yeah, that's cool.
they don't seem to be too hampered by it. But for field work, geez, I
Yeah,
can't
well, and
imagine.
also the kids are all home from school. You're teaching your courses from your, guest bedroom, like all that kind of stuff just makes the whole equation harder.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
uh, yeah, it's good to be sympathetic with one another.
yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Evan. I could chat with you for a long time. We'll have to have you back periodically to check in, see what you're up to.
Awesome.
'Cause you're always doing such cool projects,
Thanks. I
and
appreciate that.
always like hearing your voice on Twitter. Kind of getting in the fray. Really representing
Yeah,
some good perspectives there.
it's a bad habit I try to turn into a good one sometimes.
That's, I think, the best way to do it. Yeah. So it's not just for procrastination, but
There you go.
maybe getting some truth out there a little bit.
Let's hope.
Let's hope.
Anyway, it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Okay.
All right.
Cheers.
So thanks to everybody for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with another episode. So bye for now.